everybody, and welcome to today's video. We are talking about a banned game today. At least it is a game that has been banned here in Australia. It is a game that has been deemed far too vile and evil for my delicate eyes to see and my ears to hear. And I've played it and reviewed it for digitallydownloaded.net. How naughty of me. But anyhow, Skelter Finale isn't banned anywhere else in the world, so really this video is for you all. If you're Australian, you can't play it, but for everybody else, let's talk about it. It is the third and final chapter in what I personally think is the most creative dungeon crawler series that we have seen in quite some time. I was already a big fan of Skelter and what it has been doing across its chapters, and I am equally a very big fan of what it has done with this third and final one. However, I will say up front that you absolutely must have played the first two games before stepping into this one. Skelter Finale starts with a 2-hour long cutscene featuring all the characters from the previous games that are just dropped in at you, and it really does assume that you already know who they are and what they're doing. If you haven't played the previous titles, then there is a full backgrounder that you can read through to get yourself up to speed with all the cutscenes from the previous games, but to be honest, that is just many more hours of reading to even get ready for what Skelter Finale offers. No, this game really was made for existing fans first and foremost, and wasn't really worried about onboarding new players. For those existing fans though, what you need to know is that this is a magnificently ambitious project. For a start, the game juggles many multiple parties at once as their stories diverge and come back together again, and it uses that for some really intricate level design. So we all know that the typical dungeon crawler involves wandering around labyrinth levels until you find switches or keys to unlock doors that allow you to progress further. But imagine if you had to flip switches so another party of heroes could make progress in the dungeon level, and then they needed to flip a switch so your original party can also make progress themselves. I found this dynamic really fascinating in the way that it's executed in Skelter Finale, and it's a far less common approach to the crawler than what we usually see. Usually you do only have the one party that you control throughout the entire adventure, and you certainly don't need to have parties working asynchronously with one another to help each other through the kind of puzzle-like level design. The way that you need to deal with enemies in Skelter Finale is also fascinating, because each party has a different combination of characters with their own special abilities, weaknesses, and strengths. And on top of that, each dungeon level has various environmental concerns that you need to find different ways around depending on the party makeup that you have. Each character has their own special abilities that work not just in combat but also in dungeon exploration, and you need to use those abilities well in order to make progress there as well. Further adding nuance to this game is the combat system itself, which is, to be honest, it's far too complex to even bother describing here. But basically, you're not only juggling the standard set of melee and skills that you have from dungeon crawlers, but you're also dealing with the potential for characters to be corrupted to the point that they go berserk. And you also need to account for the way that characters accumulate blood as they fight, which you can subsequently lick off with other characters to reward those characters with stat boosts and so on and so forth. It is that lick bit that probably indicates why Skelter was the kind of game that would get banned in Australia. There's no real way around this. The game is really quite fetishistic in tone, and certainly the game doesn't even try and hide from that. It really revels in it. There's a lot of both overt and subtle sexualization that goes on in Skelter, including the third chapter, and the dungeons themselves have statistics like libido, which needs to be fed and controlled as you play. There's also a real fleshy undertone to the visuals and just the general style of the game, And while it is undeniably creepy, and that was part of the reason that the developers did that, it's also not there just for the sake of it. I mean, the reason these games get banned is usually because they're taken outside of context, and the context gives them a reason for doing what they do. Mary Skelter has a lot of context that the Australian censors obviously didn't really consider. Mary Skelter is one very warped subversion of the fairy tale genre, and that goes far beyond simply name-dropping characters like Snow White and Red Riding Hood into the game. It does that, but there's also more to it. And many of the nightmarish undertones that occur throughout the series, including the third chapter here, come with a kind of subtle sadism in the vein of Marquis de Sade. So the thing about Sade is that a lot of people assume that his work is really quite simple and, well, everybody knows what Sade is meant to be about, right? I don't need to describe that. But there is more to it in his writing and work. Sade was the great transgressive, and his work, as deliberately vile as it was, and it was certainly vile on purpose, was actually making a point. It wasn't there just for the sake of it. Before he ended up in asylums and the like, Sade was actually quite the revolutionary during Revolutionary era France, and his work is quite critical of the moral and ethical assumptions that come from the establishment. If you read Sade, then the first thing you realise is that he's really having a go at the church, first and foremost, and secondly, the political powers that be. He was very much a revolutionary. So for one example to back me up here, as Georges Bartal once wrote in an essay about Sade, and Bartal is one of the foremost experts that took Sade and put him into an academic context, the intention with Sade was to release dangerous movements and be their first victims. These transgressives, of which Sade is generally held up as the poster boy, are always about undermining expectations with the intent to explore their underlying values. So in other words, in the case of Mary Skelter here, subject the fairy tale tradition to an excessive, almost crass fetishization as a way of attacking the way that fairy tales are meant to be this kind of morality tale that we tell to children. To simply dismiss and subsequently ban Mary Skelter for the reasons that the Australian censors have is, entirely unsurprisingly, but still quite disappointingly, a shallow misunderstanding of all the material that is in these games. All of this is what makes Mary Skelter such a fascinating game, though, and I am almost glad that it got banned, because in being banned, the game is kind of the ultimate achievement of what the Mary Skelter series has been aiming to achieve. The dungeon crawler is so often expected to be this kind of really traditional genre, owing to the fact that it was one of the first examples of the computer RPG, and in the vein of the likes of Might and Magic and Wizardry, it is generally expected that games in the dungeon crawling genre aren't really that narrative driven. That is not meant to be the focus of them. In Mary Skelter's case, though, it is very heavily narrative driven, and as the series has shown, often quite experimental in its mechanics beyond the narrative. It is a very innovative game at core. People go in expecting a certain fan service, and because it is an Idea Factory game, a kind of nonsense about it all. But most people who actually play Mary Skelter realise that there's actually a lot more to it, and this is actually one of Idea Factory's more intelligent properties that they have done justice to the core concept of over quite a few number of years now. It is a pity that it is so readily dismissed by a certain audience out there because of some art assets that are within it, because the series itself warrants proper analysis and discussion. And the third game is no different in that regard. It is, of course, a pity that the game's been banned, because that means people can't have that discussion, and censorship as a general thing is not a positive. But I guess the point I'm making here is that Mary Skelter's purity in terms of its vision is what led to it being banned. I'm glad that the rest of the world can play this game and experience it because of that purity, and I'm obviously very disappointed for Australians that don't get that chance. Anyhow, that is enough for this video. Be sure to check out my full written review on digitallydownloaded.net, where I talk about the game itself in a lot more detail. There is a lot to this package, including a full visual novel, which is included as a bonus extra, but it is a full visual novel, and that in itself is worth exploring. I find it a bit fascinating that this hyper fan servicey game got a fan service visual novel for fans that is less fan servicey than the fan servicey game. But if you can unjumble all of those words, it is pretty interesting that this visual novel exists at all. And it in itself is actually worth some kind of analysis and consideration. So be sure to check that out if you do play the game after you've finished it, because it is fan service for the rest of the game. Anyway, thanks as always for tuning in. Do let me know your own thoughts on Merry Skelter if you have played these games, if you enjoy them. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the third one as well if you get into it. And in the meantime, if you do enjoy my videos, please do mash that like and subscribe button. That way you will get a chance to check in on each of the videos as I upload them. And also, if you do want to support what we're doing on this channel and digitally download it as a whole, you can back us on Patreon. That will set you back $1 a month at minimum. You can, of course, support us for more if you want to be generous, but the entry level is $1 a month, and in return, not only are you supporting the videos and the written work we do on DDNet, but you also get the visual novels that we produce, and you get a monthly magazine each month as well, which is pretty neat. So it's a pretty good deal in return for your support for everything that we do. Okay, thanks as always for tuning in. We will see you next time.